Have you ever watched the crime movie documentary where a suspect thought he was smarter than the detective? Join us as we study the case of Kenneth Thomas, who was the primary suspect in shooting a store owner dead during a robbery. Can you outsmart a detective? Do detectives really have the art to force confessions out of the suspects? Kenneth Johnson, along with two other suspects, entered to rob the Citgo gas station and ended up fatally shooting a gas station clerk on January 13, 2015. The police interrogated the matter, and the evidence led them to the triggerman, Kenneth Thomas. He was arrested within 12 hours of the shooting and brought in for investigation. During the investigation, the detective asked Thomas if he needs anything to eat or drink, or if he needs to use the bathroom. Thomas asks for permission to smoke a cigarette, to which the detective tells him how he has to check if he's allowed to do that, and leaves Thomas for about 15 minutes or so. During that time, he makes himself comfortable, as he does as expected.
This is Chuck, Detective Benitez. Nice to meet you, man.
After sufficient time has passed, the detectives come back and introduce themselves to Thomas and let him know what they're up to, their responsibilities, and what they know about him, like he's from Milwaukee and he works for his mom who has a business in Mississippi. One of the things that the detectives lets Thomas know is what they're looking for. That is, the truth and why did things happen the way they happened. Here, the detective ensured what he thought about Thomas. He implies that he knows Thomas did it and he wants to know the reason for Thomas. This is done to let the suspect know that the police have enough evidence for the conviction and the police are just interested in why. At the same time, he comforts Thomas by saying that they don't assume stuff. They actually listen to everybody's opinions and then form judgments, so they're not biased. Thomas yawns multiple times, showing that he's tired or bored, or it could be that he's anxious or tensed.
If someone had an idea about how something was going to go and it didn't turn out that way, why didn't it turn out that way?
Side note, it is seen that out of worry and anxiety, suspects, when left alone, often sleep in the interrogation room. Thomas doesn't drink water and tells the detectives that he knows what they're trying to do as he watches lots of detective TV shows like CSI. He tells them that he watches them to get an understanding of how they work, to which the detective tells him that they're not real. Further into the investigation, Thomas asks them who else have they investigated to get an idea about how much they might have. And then the detective changes the topic of the conversation, bringing it back to what Thomas does. Thomas confesses that he didn't have anything to do with the burglary. He was just in the car and that's why his fingerprints were on it. After this, they both start talking about Thomas's interest in music. He tells them that he sings and puts his songs on YouTube and Facebook, and he's very popular on the internet. They then discuss some disturbing things about Thomas's past, how his family broke apart, with family members going to jail, and how he had so much to deal with family-wise. As the detective inquires about Thomas's awareness of his rights, he confidently affirms his knowledge. But soon he loses his cool when he feels that the conversation is about to delve into a darker realm of crime.
I've been locked down for a day and a half.
Okay.
I still don't know what is everything about.
Okay.
Thomas starts questioning the detective as to why he was arrested and what was the interrogation about, and if the gun was not found, how could they have arrested him? Following the identification of Kenneth Thomas as a potential suspect, law enforcement obtained a search warrant to investigate his residence. During the search, compelling evidence linking him to the gas station robbery was discovered. Among the findings were marks, clothing, scratch tickets, and even the murder weapon, all of which further implicated Kenneth in the crime. On being interrogated about the same, Kenneth conveniently mentions his neighbors who had left Chicago after committing some crimes. You see where he's going. Thomas initially denied any involvement in the crime. However, as the detective presents compelling evidence against him, Thomas begins to realize that his accomplices may not have been apprehended. In an attempt to protect himself, Thomas adopts a strategy of deflecting blame onto his unnamed partners while pretending to be unaware of their identities. This approach allows him to avoid deeper questioning and maintain a facade of innocence. From the detective's perspective, this development is advantageous by withholding the full extent of the evidence. The detective encourages Thomas to provide information that implicates the other individuals involved. This deflection strategy prevents Thomas from going into a defensive mode and ultimately leads to the revelation of his neighbor's potential involvement in the crime. So according to Thomas, the two guys who lived next door brought a lot of stuff to his apartment, and he didn't remember anything else because he, along with his brothers and sisters, were smoking weed. Another notable detail was that he didn't know the names of these two men. Next, Thomas tells the detective that these two men were still in the apartment when he went to his room and dozed off. And this, he tells them as an explanation to his question about the other suspects. He earlier asked if anybody else was being questioned, and he told the police that he asked it because he thought the two guys were also arrested. Thomas's attempt to shift the blame onto a mysterious man matches perfectly with the true events of the crime, with him conveniently removing himself as the main suspect by adopting the "I've been framed" angle, and technically telling the truth without admitting his own culpability. This approach saves him from having to keep track of lies, ensuring consistency in his narrative. However, the fact that Thomas's information aligns precisely with the evidence gathered by the police raises suspicion. Normally, witnesses tend to forget or miss relevant details, but Thomas, playing the role of a witness, remembers all the crucial aspects. Essentially, Thomas has agreed to the police's version of events, and now the only task left for the detective is to establish Thomas's active involvement in the crime. After beating around the bush with the neighbor's story for a while, the detective asks Thomas about the gun that was found at his place. He tells him that the gun was found in a diaper bag. And again, acting innocent, Thomas asks about what type of gun they had found, and the detective tells him a black one.
Do these guys have a gun?
Yeah, they got lots of guns.
They got lots of guns? What kind of guns these guys got?
A few handguns.
Okay, when did you see
What kind of gun
handguns?
was this?
What's a handgun?
Well, I know it was a handgun.
This is a black one.
A black, like what type of handgun?
The detective carefully chooses not to provide the complete answer to Thomas's question regarding the make of the gun. The detective's intention is to withhold crucial evidence that directly links Thomas to the crime until the appropriate moment. Initially, the detective plays dumb about the specific make of the gun, referring to it as a handgun, then a black gun, and then later as a 9mm. And eventually, without any effort on the detective's part, Thomas admits to owning a black handgun, a Hi-Point C9 to be specific.
So yeah, he had a black handgun? Okay, before you said something about a Hi-Point.
Yeah, that's what he said.
This reveals that Thomas had knowledge of the existence of the gun throughout the investigation. If Kenneth had been more astute, he would have claimed to have never seen any gun at all. Furthermore, if he had been even more cautious, he would have even requested a lawyer and ceased further communication with the detective. Instead, he keeps weaving details into the neighbor's story, telling the detective that they would bring a lot of guns and that night they had 3 guns. The detective asks Thomas about the details when he tells him that a gun is registered in his mother's name, and he has some bullets too. If Thomas thinks he's smarter, why would he reveal this detail? Well, Kenneth knew that there must be his fingerprints on the bullet casings, so he smartly tells the detective that he had some bullets that he gave to those men. Thomas adds more details until the detective tells him about the other evidence they've collected, which is a big revelation for Thomas. Thomas is now convinced that the police have conclusive evidence about him, and that he decides to change the narrative of his story by telling the detective that he was framed by his neighbors. He said that they robbed and dumped all the things on them. When the detectives don't believe him, Thomas asks him what was the exact evidence that linked them to the crime. The detective tells him about the Milwaukee department calling them that they had found the evidence at his house. Thomas is not ready to back off, and he keeps arguing, asking for clear pictures. Thomas knows that without any fingerprints or his face in the footage, he cannot be convicted. But he is not aware that the more he talks, the more he gives away the information leading to the crime. And then the detective tells him straight that he knows Thomas did it already. He just wants to know if he did it by accident or on purpose. He tells Thomas about his punishment, but he keeps denying his involvement, saying that the police don't have fingerprints or his face on camera. The detective plays Thomas's game and tells him that he would still be convicted if he provided bullets that took someone's life. And now Thomas tells the detective that he's on some medication and he doesn't know what's going on with him. He even goes on to say that even though the police have evidence against him, he would never admit to anything. Later, Kenneth Thomas admitted that he had shot Saeed Sharvani when he caught him and scared him. He was shot in the chest and died after a short while. The idea that this criminal was able to outsmart the detectives for a while makes me really surprised. Not as surprised as when I watched when a murderer pretends to be a victim. Click that video right here and don't forget to subscribe.